Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary-Salt.
And I'm Sebastian.Moore.
And in another busy week at SDP Towers, we are squeezing in a news item to bring you a couple of items that have taken our fancy this week. And Sebastian, you want to talk about new media versus old media. What new challenges does that bring up?
Yeah, I think we're back to our traditional roles of you talking about something quite technical and me talking about gossip, like new podcast gossip.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so this will be quite a meta conversation, because we're going to be a podcast talking about a podcast talking about a podcast.
Right, okay. One of those like infinite mirrors.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to... Well, I thought this is something that is worth discussing because I think it's quite a seismic moment, which is that the Joe Rogan Experience,
Yes.
which is the biggest podcast in the world, recently had a debate by basically Douglas Murray, who's on the sort of broadly the pro-Israel side, and then Dave Smith, who's on the pro-Palestine side.
Okay.
I say broadly because I think there are bits of agreement where they both sort of agree with each other, but they are very much in those camps.
Yes.
And these are two people that I've listened to, many times in the past. I think Douglas Murray is a really interesting person. I've read his books. I think he has a lot to say on the world. I think Dave Smith's very entertaining comedian, etc., because he is a comedian, but he's kind of branched into this world of politics. And so the reason I wanted to bring it up is that I think this represents quite a shift in the conversation around where we get our media, because what's been happening for a long time is old media has been dying and the new media has sort of been taking its place, and we're not really sure about what that is going to look like. And I think until now there's been a lot of optimism, from me included, massively. I've been very, very optimistic about the rise of podcasts as a place to get your information. But I think this episode of Joe Rogan shone a light on some of the challenges around podcasts and new media.
And the fallout from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So firstly, I'll just say that it came out 13 days ago and it's already got over 4 million views. And that's kind of fairly typical for a Joe Rogan episode. I mean, the Donald Trump one had, I think, 60 million views in 2 days.
Wow.
And this is at a time when TV ratings have kind of fallen massively.
Do we know of that 4 million, how many are in the US and how many elsewhere?
I mean, they will know because they'll have the analytics showing where people are watching it from, but we don't know. No.
Okay.
The point is broadly that new media, you could say it's overtaken old media in terms of viewership, but it's certainly caught up.
Okay.
If you're getting tens of millions of views on just one episode on one person's YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Whereas the most viewed program in the UK last week, I think, was The Apprentice, and it had 5 million views. Okay. So you can kind of get an idea about what information people are consuming, or what entertainment. And this speaks to the problem, which is that we are, in the past, I think it was a little bit clearer what was information and what was entertainment. Yeah. And I spoke to you about a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I highly, highly recommend. Yeah. And it talks about the way that as we went to a more visual worldview, which is cable news and TVs in the classrooms, the line between information and entertainment was blurred. And I think we had phrases like infotainment. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the age that we're living in. And the YouTube and podcasting, I think if you were to speak about it in the best way possible, you'd say there's loads of really intelligent people who are giving a very informative take on world issues. Yeah. If you were to be quite negative about it, you'd say there's lots of unexperienced people that are not experts in their field that are speaking broadly on topics they don't understand.
And that's the issue that's arisen.
Exactly. So
here, isn't it?
Yeah, and in some ways I was quite disappointed in the debate. I think it was interesting in certain aspects, but it starts off, and for the first 50 minutes, Douglas Murray is basically putting his point across that Joe Rogan and others have platformed individuals that are not experts on topics like history. Think people like Darryl Cooper, Don't know if you've come across him before.
Don't know him, no.
So he doesn't call himself an historian, but he will speak about history and he'll say things, quite provocative things like Churchill was the biggest villain of World War II.
Oh, he's the one who said that.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Which caused a big outrage.
Yeah,
and I
did,
think his point was that he was trying to be outrageous. But he's not. I think historians have come out and said, you're wildly wrong about this and about other things. And Douglas Murray's point was saying that, yes, anybody can say what they like. Douglas Murray is a free speech advocate, but you shouldn't be purposefully platforming people that aren't experts in their field.
Okay.
Now, I think he was wrong in some ways, because I think Joe Rogan attempts to get people on that are interesting, and then sort of the conversation goes where it will. And I think that's very much Joe Rogan's model of podcasting. It's why people like me have been fans of Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan podcast, for many years.
Yeah.
But I also think he has a point. So his broad argument was the fact that you shouldn't be platforming these people that are not experts.
Yep.
And then there was another really interesting bit later on in the debate. And I think it's worth saying to viewers that this isn't, we're not discussing the merits of the arguments here, because if you go down that avenue of Israel-Palestine, that's a completely different conversation. We're purely talking about how these conversations are held and whether it's beneficial to people, the electorate.
Yeah, old media v new media.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. And so the other interesting aspect of the podcast was the quite far deep into the debate. Douglas Murray said, when was the last time you saw one of these crossing points between Israel and Gaza? And Dave Smith says, I haven't. And he says, okay, when were you last in the region at all? He said, I've never been. And Douglas Murray, whether he was genuinely shocked or whether it was a bit of a performance, he showed that he thought it was ridiculous that Dave Smith is commenting on these things without having been to the place. I think this has exposed a really interesting distinction between those that put a high value on seeing the thing in reality, and those that say, no, you can get all your information from afar, from the internet and so on. What did you think about that?
Yeah, so that is that's a debate that's happening in journalism as well, isn't it? So I know that's a really big global issue you're talking about, but if you think about local newspapers, a lot of people would say the problem with the death of the local newspaper is that you have no journalists on the ground talking to people in Openshaw or Wakefield or places where they're reporting on. And I think a lot of people would say that that's something we've really lost with the death of local newspapers, and actually having boots on the ground, as it were, is actually really important to be able to really understand a community and an issue that's arisen. And when you just, try to report from afar, which, the local newspapers are trying to do now because they just syndicate a story, don't they, around all their newspapers, that is a problem. So I have a lot of sympathy with the argument that says that to really understand an issue, you do have to have a real connection. And that probably does mean being there or having a clear route in. So you're talking to people who are there at least.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is one point where I think I found myself perhaps in the minority. Maybe we're both in the minority, because seemingly from the response to this video, people were firstly mocking Douglas Murray for his suggestion that you would have to visit the place in order to have a view on it. But I actually really agree. And, I've visited places like Kosovo and Armenia, Transnistria, places that there are geopolitical issues and conflicts and ethnic tensions. And I still, just by going there, it's a bit of the sort of the Dunning-Kruger effect, isn't it? When you learn something more about an issue, you realise how ignorant you are.
Yeah.
And even after visiting those places, I'm very reluctant to give my opinions on them because it is so complex.
Yeah.
And so I really agree with him that, it's not to say you can't have an opinion, because there are limits to being able to go to places other side of the world, time and money. Two issues, to be fair, that I think Dave Smith probably is not such a big problem for him. I think he probably does have the time and money to go and visit.
Okay.
Anyway, but there are limits to being able to do that. But if you care enough about this issue, that you're speaking about it frequently, which Dave Smith is, why not make the effort to go and visit that place and speak to the locals? So I very much agree with him there. This issue on experts is an interesting one, and this gets to a deeper argument about whether new media is a source of for good. I had an argument recently with a journalist from Reuters, who's a war correspondent, and we were arguing about legacy media, versus new media, and I said, well, it's a lot of it is it's legacy media's fault that they've been so dishonest and haven't put the effort into really being impartial or certainly speaking to both sides of the issue.
Yeah.
But having said that, there is this issue that not everybody's an expert. We do want experts, right?
We do.
So interestingly, Konstantin Kisin, who hosts a podcast called Trigonometry here in the UK, he actually had a response to this video. And this is why I say it's a bit meta, because we're responding to a response to a video. But I did think it's worth just playing this and responding to it.
On numerous occasions throughout the discussion, Murray commits the greatest sin available in Podcastistan, suggesting that certain people shouldn't comment on certain things and that others should not elevate their voices. Such is the inability to think clearly about this that you would almost certainly receive less pushback for denying that slavery harmed Black Americans or claiming the Holocaust didn't happen. They simply no longer understand the difference between censorship, this must be banned, and morality, this is a bad thing to do. The world of entertainment is not driven by truth-seeking, and the claim that someone's ideas are false is no longer an effective critique. Podcastistan is a place where people scold the mainstream media for failing to live up to their standards on honesty and accuracy while having none of their own.
So I think he's making a very, very good point, which is to say, if you're going to criticise legacy media and old media for not being honest and not putting in the necessary due diligence in terms of really researching an issue, that doesn't mean you can just do the exact same thing as them. And that's a real challenge to this new media ecosystem, because more and more people are getting their information from these podcasts, from these YouTube channels. So I think it's a challenge to YouTubers, to us, as well, because we are doing this podcast, to rather than shirking our responsibility, to really take that responsibility, run with it, and say, yes, if this is where people are getting their information, we need to be more thorough in terms of our research and in terms of who we speak to.
And Konstantin Kisin is one of those people who's been very optimistic about podcasts being the future, isn't he? So is this a bit of a turnaround for him?
He says at the start of the video, I'm going to do something unprecedented and admit that I was wrong.
Oh, wow, okay,
And this is why I think it's quite a seismic moment. As I say, I'm not in the business of responding to people online, because I think that you get into this weird sort of cyclical response. But yeah, I think this is a potential turning point for where we as consumers and people that are involved in politics and where we get information, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to the right places? And that isn't an easy question to answer.
No.
My suggestion is what Douglas Murray says, put more of a premium on visiting the place and getting a visual on these things. And I don't mean just Israel, for example, but I mean the bike lanes on Deansgate.
Yes.
Cycle down there and see what you think.
Yeah. Or go to Runcorn.
Yes.
Where we're currently running our by-election campaign and talk to people on Frodsham Market, which is what we did a couple of weeks ago, isn't it?
Exactly. And we were knocking on doors on Monday, and you might read articles in the media, on the BBC, about voting intentions in Runcorn, of who's it between, which parties have a chance of winning. And then you go and knock on doors and you get a different sense.
Very different,
We were both surprised, weren't
we? Were, yes,
There wasn't... I mean, we were expecting no love for Labour.
Indeed, and we found that, certainly.
That was confirmed. I mean, I think out of all the doors I knocked, which, potentially 100 doors on Monday, I think I found one person that was admitting that they were going to vote Labour.
Okay.
Obviously, more than 1% will vote Labour, but somebody that was happy to admit, and even they couldn't really say anything that the government was doing well.
Yeah.
But what really surprised us was the reform. We thought there'd be a little bit more love for reform, and there wasn't. Some people seemed almost reluctant. They were like, you know what, I'm just going to vote reform.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think reform could do well, but I don't think
Yes.
that support will be particularly enthusiastic.
Indeed, not very positive support. More, I've just got to say no to Labour more than anything. Yeah.
So potential solution, actually get involved with things, actually get on the ground, pay a little bit less attention to your mobile phone and to your computer, and pay more attention to this.
Okay.
Unless you're watching Take Me Home.
In which case, just, listen to us. Yeah, yeah. So you made me feel very nervous about imparting any expertise now, because I want to talk about the jobs market and what's happening on jobs.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that are worrying people and making people look at what's happening in the jobs market. And the first is the changes that we've talked about before that came through in the budget. So there's two big changes that happened in April. One is the rise in the national minimum wage. So to remind people, the headline minimum wage went up from £11.44 to £12.21, which is about a 7% increase. But there are much bigger rises in the minimum wages for the under 18s and the 18 to 20s. So, that will hit quite a lot of employers, the rise in minimum wage. And the other thing that came through in the budget was that change to employers' national insurance. So we talked about this in the budget issue. There's a rise in the percentage that employers pay, but I think much more important for people who employ a lot of lower paid people is the fall in the threshold above which employers pay NI. And that will come through for employers. If they pay people monthly, it'll come through next month. And if they're paying people weekly, it'll come through this month. So those budget changes.
This week.
Yes, yeah.
You said this month. But
Well, if you're paying people monthly, you pay them their April pay in April, but you will pay your employers NI in May.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of the way payroll works. So there's those things. And then the other thing that obviously is all over the news is the impact of tariffs and the US tariffs. So if people haven't listened to it already, people should listen to the SDP talk with Catherine McBride and William Clouston, where they talk quite a lot about this. But I don't want to repeat the things that they said, but just to say there are clearly UK manufacturing organisations that will be hit by the tariffs. And I know they talked about the aerospace industry. There's also car making. We do still export quite a lot of luxury cars, especially to the US. And they will be being hit by this. So there's a lot of kind of free-floating anxiety about what does this mean for jobs. And all that is kind of a bit of a run-up to the big point that I want to make, which is that we do have a real problem with getting information about the jobs market and how many people are employed. And this probably sounds mad if you're not familiar with the issue, but the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, is responsible for collecting information about the labour force. And they do that using this thing called the Labour Force Survey, the LFS. Now, really strangely, I think, what this is a survey of individual households asking them about their employment, which could be self-employment or actual employment. And the data that we get from that has been all over the place over the past year or so. And there's a lot of the kind of same things that affect other things like polling. So people are less willing to fill in a survey these days. They're less willing to take a cold call. They're less willing to give out data to people. So the information that the Labour Force Survey collects has been more and more patchy. And this has been recognised quite widely, not just by the ONS itself, but more widely it's been criticised by the Bank of England and by the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, the OBR. So I think everybody recognises there's a problem. They've been trialling a new, I can't quite remember the name of it, but the Transformed Labour Force Survey or something it's called, which is a shorter survey. And that will be fully functional, I think, by next year. But it's still relying on this idea that you have to go around and, metaphorically probably, knock on doors and gather information that way, which is it seems to me, in the current times that we live in, that's a very unreliable way to collect data. And particularly, this is data that is really important. So there are some big decisions being made at the moment. Mm-hmm. So the Commons Business and Trade Committee, which is Liam Byrne's committee, you might remember him. He's a person who left the note in the drawer.
There's no money left.
There's no money left, exactly.
I bet he regrets that now.
He
That's
must do.
The only thing we ever remember about Liam Byrne.
Absolutely, yeah. So his committee has been taking evidence last week from different businesses that are going to be affected by tariffs. So motor manufacturing, for example, is one of those. And that committee is thinking very seriously about things like, should they be introducing a new furlough scheme for these employees who might be affected? Should they be introducing some of the other pandemic-style things that they introduce? So, for example, giving employers a holiday on their NI contributions, or on paying VAT, they can pay VAT late, or on corporation tax. So they're talking about a whole raft of potential interventions for those businesses. And yet we're making those kind of decisions without any really clear idea of what's happening with the labour force. And that seems to me a real problem that we need to fix. Mm-hmm. So what do we do about it, I guess, is a big question. Now, there are other sources of data. So there are data, for example, on payroll, how many people are on payroll. Now, that works for those people who are paid through PAYE, so employees. Doesn't work very well for people who are in self-employment. And there are other measures. So, for example, government will know how much it collects in employer NI every month. So, it can use that kind of data. But there just doesn't seem to be any way of tapping into that data properly. And this kind of feels like it's something that has been just allowed to just drift, and nobody's really taken hold of it. I know there are real problems at places like the ONS with lack of funding, cuts in the numbers of staff. I know they're one of those organisations that's in dispute about not being able to continue working from home. Mm-hmm. And I do think that we've really got to start tackling the fact that we don't seem to be able to do the basics of statecraft anymore, which includes being able to measure data properly. Now, you might have heard of MTD?
MTD?
Mm-hmm.
No.
So MTD is a project that the Treasury is running called Making Tax Digital.
Okay.
So the idea of this is that when they look, for example, at big companies' VAT returns, they can look through those VAT returns to the suppliers to that company so that they can see the VAT returns of the businesses below them, and they can kind of drill down so they can make sure that VAT audit trail kind of works all the way up. And it's good and bad in that I think it's a good thing to be able to do that because it makes your tax system much more robust. And whether we like paying tax or not, I think we all want it to be fair. So we don't want there to be big loopholes. So in that way, it's good. But what it does do is it kind of pushes the responsibility for tax collection and data collection onto businesses.
Right.
Which is another thing that businesses have to do that makes them less efficient. Mm-hmm. And, if you're a small supplier to you supply one part to a motor manufacturer, but you only do that, you're a small business, you've got to be able to do the Making Tax Digital stuff. Whereas before you might have, not quite at this level, but you might have put all your receipts in a shoebox and then given them to your accountant at the end of the year. You can't do that anymore.
And we want to be making it easier for businesses to operate, don't we?
We do. And to be fair, there are lots of organisations, the kind of people who produce accountancy packages who are trying to make this easy and trying to come up with technological ways to do it. And I don't have any problem with that. I think that's a good thing. But we need to, I think, almost have a reset of thinking about why is it important to collect that data? And it is important because government is trying to make really big decisions, and it needs to make those decisions on the basis of robust and credible data. And at the moment, it feels like we haven't got that.
Okay.
So a shout out really to be a bit more efficient and maybe a little bit more bureaucratic.
A bit more bureaucratic. Wow.
About the way that we collect data.
We want more bureaucracy.
But in a way that,
but it is amazing how sort of archaic some of these practices are to collect data. I mean, we were talking about the consumer price index.
We were, yeah.
You know, how do they find the consumer price index?
So the basket of goods that people might be aware that underlies the retail part of the consumer price index is established by people going around buying things. So buying a pot of jam or a loaf of bread.
It literally is a basket of goods. I mean, you told me this yesterday. I was shocked. I just assumed it was a euphemism.
No, it really is a basket of goods. And if you think about it, the kind of data that supermarkets collect, you know, they could scrape that data really easily and produce a much more reliable measure of the price of the retail bits of the cost of living.
Yeah.
But no, we do stick to the sending people around with a shopping list.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps finally, just to say, if you are approached to fill in the labour force survey, please do it. You do get a voucher for doing it, and you will be contributing to collection of robust data to help inform government decisions.
What's the voucher?
I don't actually know.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm sure you can find it if you Google it.
Okay. Good stuff.
Great. So thanks everybody for listening. We will see you again next week. Thanks for listening. Do subscribe, follow, like, recommend to your friends.
See you soon.